You're now tuning in to Performotion Podcast, where we talk powerlifting and rehab with our coaches, guests, and exercise physiologists. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Roundtable. And today we're going to be progressing off what we spoke about in the past couple episodes. So we've covered mostly the biomechanics around squatting, benching, and deadlifting. In these following series, we're going to cover the programming aspect of things. So how leverages and how people's differences kind of relate into how we program individually for, our specific clients, right? Because as everyone comes in, we start to go through this individualization process, and the hopeful outcome is that you have a program tailored to you, which pretty much maximizes your outcomes for squatting, benching, deadlifting, right? So in this first episode, we're going to cover the squat. I think it's important to lay the groundwork and talk about influences that we consider when we do start to think about writing a program out for the person in front of us, right? So things I've got that we could cover today would be leverages, the person's level of strength, their recoverability, as well as their size. I guess we could also add in their gender as well, male, female. So those five, I think, are really, fundamental places that we could start from. And yeah, let's go from there. Let's kick things off with leverages. So, Leanne, did you want to kick things off? And I guess to prompt you, we could talk about, leverages that allow people to be a bit more upright versus people that are predisposed to be a bit more hingier.
Yeah. So I guess, like you said, leverages is something that's definitely going to influence how you program a squat. So if someone is more built to squat, you're probably going to see more of a longer torso, potentially shorter femur length. That way they are staying more upright. They're able to stay within their quads and their legs a lot easier. So they can usually get away with more squatting volume. Say, for example, someone who is more of a hingy squatter, they might have potentially more longer femurs, maybe a shorter torso. In that more of a hinge position, they might feel like they use more of their lower back alongside their legs with their squats. So potentially they might not be able to do as much volume as, say, someone who is built to squat. But in saying that, it's very context dependent and very individualized. So usually I will look at someone, say someone's coming to me, I will usually look at like what they have been doing previously rather than going and changing their whole program. Say if they are someone who is a pretty upright squatter, but they have been running really low volume and it's been working. I don't think it's necessarily something you need to change straight away, but more just like taking into account that it's something to consider with their leverages, and maybe in the future, like they could potentially get away with adding in more volume to get stronger.
Yeah. For, I guess, more upright people, right? When you think of a squat pattern, it's mainly going to be just knee dominant, knee extension, right? That's the ideal. But like you pointed out, for people that are hingier, they just can't get into that position. And therefore, the cost of fatigue for each rep that you're doing is much greater in comparison to someone who is upright, right? So I guess I know we can't really get to a definite answer when we look at determining like what's most optimal in terms of volume, intensity, frequency for these people, right? But in terms of where a good place to start is, where do you think that I guess baseline could be?
In terms of like their frequency of how many days they're like squatting, is that kind of what you mean? Or
Yeah, so frequency, how often they're squatting, and then as well as like volume and intensity.
yeah, so like I said, I guess starting with where they currently are at. So like if they already had like a previous program, if they're squatting twice a week, starting there rather than going and adding in a third or a fourth day. Just start with their baseline and then kind of see what happens along that first block. Rather than changing everything straight away.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's a pretty common thing that you could start off with, regardless of whether someone's efficient or not efficient based off their leverages, right? I think when we look at what we can control as coaches, which is going to be those main factors: frequency, volume, intensity, and exercise selection. We do have our idea of where we want someone to end up, and I guess what they can tolerate in the moment. But like, you're just going to have to wait and see and let things play out, right? And when you do have all these factors, and we've just covered leverages, you know, they might be able to recover a lot faster despite having, I guess, inefficient leverages. You never know, right? So that's why a lot of programming, or the way that we see it, it's very wait and see kind of thing. It's very bottom up, very reactive in a sense. I guess we could cover next.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sam, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to segue off that and just say, like, obviously all these kind of factors, they all tie into each other, right? So we can't really talk about like leverages without talking about like, the frequency of squat and deadlift and like their recoverability and their size and their strength level all in one. So like it's kind of, we can look at each one independently, but it's very much like they all intertwine with each other. So like, with leverages, for example, looking at like balancing squat and deadlift. So yes, they might be well built to squat, but then because of that, they also might not be very leveraged to deadlifts. Then we've got to look at like the spacings between squat and deadlift layout, and then look at like the volume and frequency that we're programming for their squat due to their deadlift. So it all kind of ties into one when we're looking at like programming in general, which obviously makes it like tricky and fun and enjoyable to kind of work out the pieces of the puzzle. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to throw that in there based off kind of where the discussion was heading.
Yeah, you prompted me to think of something as well, back to leverages. I think for when you do have someone who is a more upright squatter due to having favorable leverages, that just assumes that they're going to be able to be more efficient, right? So what you can, I guess, start off with is the idea that perhaps they might be able to handle high frequency, high volume, high intensity all at once, right? In comparison to someone who's a bit hingier, maybe you might have to fix one of those three factors for a period of time whilst trying to push it one of those factors. So for example, if someone who's predisposed to being a hingier squatter, their frequency might have to stay at 2 times, their volume has to stay the same whilst they're trying to push heavier intensities. Because if they're trying to push volume at the same time, for example, like they're doing 8s while they're also trying to push their top singles, top triples, that's going to be disproportionately more fatiguing in comparison to someone who could, like, I imagine they could end up squatting 3 times a week, doing high volume on one given day, and then at the end of the week, they're still squatting like really, really high intensity, top singles, top doubles, top triples, and still reporting that they're progressing just fine, right? I think that's generally something you could kind of see for people that are more predisposed to being efficient in a given lift.
Yeah. So generally, like, we'd look at going towards the top end of what they can handle, or, balancing that with what they've done before. And then again, like assuming that they're not as well leveraged for deadlifts, we're assuming that their deadlift frequency, volume, and intensity is going to be on the lower end. So they probably can handle the top end of squat frequency and volume, or whatever kind of modality they're pushing, like if it's pushing volume or if it's pushing intensity, whereas the deadlift will stay like kind of minimum dose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with that as well. I guess what we can move on then, apart from leverages, then is someone's level of strength. So whether someone's a beginner, intermediate, advanced, and I guess we'll talk about it in the context of just absolute load that someone's able to lift, right? So the more load you have on your back on a squat, the more axially fatiguing it's going to be, right? The fatigue of just literally walking out 400 kilos is going to be a lot more compared to walking out 40 kilos, right? So with that in mind, we could talk about how that influences how much someone can handle. Naturally, if every rep you're doing is in like 200, 300, really high absolute load, you're only going to be able to do so much, right? In comparison to someone who might be able to handle more. I guess I think this one's a bit easier to discuss in terms of like what the implications of that is, right? Because, you know, someone who doesn't handle a lot of absolute load is going to have to train or can train a lot more often, a lot harder, and do more, right? Leanne, did you want to speak about this as well?
Yeah, I guess if you look at it from, say, a beginner versus advanced, someone who is a beginner might feel like they can kind of just push everything and everything's kind of just going to linearly progress, through those first stages, which is totally fine. And I don't think it's a bad thing to push those both days. Kind of just let them do what they want to do. And then as they get stronger and you start to get, I guess, towards those intermediate and more elite levels is where you have to prioritize more, I guess, like having like those primary and, secondary, tertiary days, making sure the tertiary and the secondary days are kind of lining up so that it's making that primary day feel strong. So that's something that I really educate my clients on, is like finding what stimulus makes that primary feel good. And I guess like over time, we want to see like those secondary and tertiary days, the numbers creeping up. But it's like if you can see that primary day is increasing load like over time, doesn't have to be linear. But if you can see that that is what is showing up and feeling strong, then I guess you're on the right track. When you get to like those later stages of lifting and you're not just seeing like everything is like progressing by +5, +10 kilos every single week. It's just like managing the priority. Even for example, like if you know, like you have a top set on, or you have like two primary days, one has a top set and then one has like high volume. What I will tend to like educate on is like you can like push the reps on that high rep day, and then the other primary day focus on like the top set. So rather than like pushing everything all at once, it's like just knowing what the priority is for that session. Yeah, I think is something that's important.
Yeah. So that's like, yeah, if we look at kind of my program, for example, at the moment, you have like one day where you might be pushing more volume and one day where you're pushing more intensity. So like if we take like my peak into states, for example, I had my Tuesday, which was like, it was my fives, it was my fours, and they were towards the end of the peak, they stayed pretty static for myself. Whereas at the end of the week on my Saturday, I had like all my intensity. So each week I had like doubles or singles, whatever it was. And each week they were climbing whilst the Tuesday volume stayed somewhat static. And this is where it comes quite individualized in terms of what a lifter can handle in terms of their leverages, their training age, their strength. So if we take like, myself being a heavyweight female, heavyweight male.
Female.
Heavyweight female. Yeah, I got something to say. No. Heavyweight male, my program might say a bit more static on those secondary days, or I might have bigger percentage drops, or I might not push both days as hard. Whereas if we take like a lighter weight or middle weight female, I'll say it right, they might be able to handle more volume. They might be able to handle pushing both of those days, or pushing the volume and pushing the intensity, kind of like what you were talking about, Leanne. So it's very much individualized. Again, kind of factoring in all these other factors in terms of what someone can handle. But yeah, that's also a good way of like kind of looking at programming the squat, is pushing different modalities on different days in your training week.
Yeah, I think the overarching concept I'm hearing is, when you are at that lower strength level, fatigue management isn't as important as a factor in comparison to as you get stronger, right? Once you get stronger, you can't just, I guess, train like the minimum is training hard, but you can't train to the maximum capacity that you can every single day, right? Because you're just gonna burn yourself into the ground physically, mentally as well, right? Whereas in comparison to if you're not as strong, pretty much it's just push everything as hard as you can, right? And literally just effort over everything. I think you pointed out something really important, Sam, about pushing different modalities. And I think I can relate that to exercise selection as an important part for how strength levels play into that, right? And I guess there's various kind of perspectives. let's talk about strength level not as like beginner, intermediate, advanced, and like assume someone can train competently, but it's literally just like how strong you are, right? So, for example, if you're on the high end of the spectrum and you need to somewhat dial your fatigue in, I think using variations that are load limiting can be very useful in that situation. So if we're talking about squatting, things like tempo, pause, high bar, possibly front squat, SSB, all these kinds of things can help, not in the sense of um, like to help push your top end, but it's almost like here's something that is going to limit how much load you can put on the day, and you can progressively overload from here. Because if you add every single day as some sort of competition squat and you have the mindset of just pushing, you're going to end up like forcing things, right? And I guess that could play into like someone's autonomy as well. You could tell someone like, hey, even though we're doing comp squat like on all our days, I want you to prioritize this one. Or as a coach, you could just like fix things using the constraint by forcing them to not be able to load as much, right? I think that's just something to, as coaches, we have something in our toolbox.
I think it's a combination of both. So like the athlete having autonomy around load selection, but then also as a coach, like knowing that if you are to like implement this variation, that it's gonna manage the load a lot better, so that they're gonna end up feeling better on their primary anyway. So it's just like that combination.
Yeah, agreed, 100%.
I think just to play devil's advocate really quick, I think it's like important to note, like if you're programming a variation, when it's controlling the athlete too much. I found like with some of my like kind of lower training age kind of lifters, if I've programmed like, you know, a variation on a secondary day, sometimes I've kind of noticed that it's restricting them too much to where they, like what Liam was saying before, they can't push both days. So they're not kind of building this baseline volume, or they're not just getting enough reps and weight on their back throughout the training week to push some kind of general kind of progression when they're first starting out. So I think like it's important to kind of, you know, recognize when an athlete might need more in that sense. So like, okay, this variation is purely just kind of slowing them down. Let's just try going comp squat on both days and let both days just go for a little bit and see if that helps kind of like that top end feel a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. I think you gave a certain face when I mentioned SSBs, right? And I think implicitly it's like this isn't loadable. It's not comp specific, right? And it, like you said, it was very comp.
It was front squat.
Oh, it was front squat. Right.
It's a bit delayed. Touchy subject.
I think we had a podcast episode previously where we were rating like different squat variations, and I think I've changed my mind on the front squat somewhat. I would never prescribe it as almost like the first thing you do on a secondary day. But let's say, for example, if someone needs more squat volume and you don't feel comfortable giving them like extra volume on top of their first secondary squat movement, for example, something like someone's doing high bar on one day and then they comp squat another day, perhaps you could do high bar, back it up with front squat, right? For example, if someone doesn't have something like a hack squat or like a leg press, like I think in the past I swung one way where it's like front squats is just garbage and like there's no good case to use it. But yeah, I've changed my mind on it. Like, if someone really is that equipment constrained, it's like that's when it's good.
Yeah, I actually have a client who does front squats at the moment, and the reason why is partly because she doesn't have access to equipment, but then also she's done them in the past and she's like, I love doing front squats. So I'm like, look, if you love doing them, let's just add them in there. And it's like her squats been going well. So yeah, it's not like it's the end of the world if you have to do something you know, less optimal.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I was just being funny, making a face, because it's just that classic, like, you know, modern powerlifting Instagram kind of argument where everyone just thinks front squats are trash, but they definitely have a place. I'm the same. I've got a client who's doing it at the moment purely because he enjoys them, and it's just like another way to get a bit extra like volume in.
Yeah, exactly.
But just Danny brought it up, and I was like, ooh, front squats.
Yeah, I think now that I mention it, like we all have people that do it, right? It's not as long as you put it in the right spot, but it's definitely not the first place I would go. And to relate it back to what you brought up initially, it's because of the fact that some people need that sense of effort, right? Like effort is going to be the constant, whether you're not that strong, intermediately strong, or like super strong. You need to be putting in effort. And sometimes when it's like a load limiting variation, one, you don't get as much enthusiasm out of it. But say even if you do, it might not be enough absolute load, right? But I think it's more likely that you can still get something out of it when you are stronger. Yeah. I guess we could move on to recoverability. And I think the most, this kind of breaks up into a couple things. You got gender, that's like a big determinant. And then you also have someone's size, right? Recoverability is kind of difficult to kind of like pin on one certain thing, because as coaches, we can't just like look at someone's genetics and be like, this guy's a fast recovery kind of person, right? But it's like you can kind of gather all these like three things that I mentioned. So like size, gender, strength, and that kind of underpins like how fast someone can recover, right? I guess to talk about it, I guess if someone has a high recoverability, obviously they can handle more training, right? And they should be receiving higher training. So when we break it down, you look at how absolute load kind of also matches with someone's gender. You got, for example, male, female both lifting the same weight. I believe the female would recover faster, assuming size is also the same, right? Like I think I fixed a lot of things there, but it's like that's how difficult it is, right? Because everyone's so different. But when you think about it, trying to tug at looking at one, everything kind of plays out into how you determine like frequency, volume, intensity, exercise selection.
Yeah, like I said before, right? It's just so hard because they all tie into each other. But I guess we can kind of assume that, yeah, like I said before, if someone's more leveraged to squat, they're going to have a higher recoverability, be able to handle more. If you tie that in with someone who's very, very strong and lifting a lot of absolute load, then maybe that recoverability will be a little bit less. So if you tie that factor in, et cetera, et cetera. And also, with deadlifts too. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also like training age.
Down to
training age of someone. So like if you have the same leverage person versus a beginner, like versus advanced, someone who is advanced might not be able to handle the same level of volume or intensity as the beginner, just because, I guess, of that absolute load that they're lifting. So recoverability would be lower if they were handling having the same amount of training volume per week. That makes sense.
Yeah. I think we could dive into that a bit more. Like it's an interesting point. We could talk about like how do you program a beginner versus someone who's intermediate, versus someone who's super elite, right? Because I think when we think about it, it's like if you're on the come up and you're kind of like looking at what the best people in the sport do, how do you guys kind of see that within your own roster?
Do you want to repeat the question? Sorry,
my dog's going crazy in the back, hence why I muted in the for our listeners. But I guess how does programming look different for someone who's a beginner versus someone who's intermediate versus someone who's like at the top of the game or super elite, right? Obviously, we don't have access to the most elite people's programs, but when you look at your own roster, how does it kind of change?
I feel like for the more intermediate and advanced lifters, I find that I'm tending to kind of like cycle their training volume. So like depending on where they are, in season, whether they're like close to a competition or not, I guess because if they have like really high volume all the time, I find that they tend to just get like beat up and like kind of hit a plateau. Whereas if you can like kind of manage it and that they're like peaking towards their competition and they're going to feel strongest there, then obviously that's like what we're aiming for. So yeah, I think I guess like looking at what the goal is for that block. So say for example, like if at the start of the block, like I'll have a conversation with the athlete and be like, okay, this block we're really pushing volume. Don't worry, like we're going to keep top sets in there, but like don't worry about, you're not aiming to hit PRs in this block. It's like we're kind of building you and building this base to then further into, the following blocks to hit the PRs on like the top set. So it's like just knowing what the priority is of that block and at that time during the training.
Yeah. How does that differ to someone who's a more beginner then?
I guess as a beginner, like we kind of talked about before, we can pretty much just push everything all the time. So I'm not really wanting to hold them back necessarily. It's more just like go ham on your accessories, but then also don't be afraid to push like your main work as well. And it's kind of just like seeing what happens, kind of figuring out like where they're showing up, what's feeling strong, what's not, and we're kind of able to make a lot more adjustments along the way. Whereas someone who, like, if we've been working together for a longer period of time or they're more elite, they're going to know pretty much exactly what makes them feel strong. So it's just managing that and knowing when we want them feeling the strongest and knowing what the goal is at that time.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a wrench in the works here. I guess it's to do with buy-in, enjoyability, and how that relates to when you are working with beginners, intermediate, advanced. Because at the end of the day, if someone's not bought into it, they're not enjoying their training, they're less likely to be doing the training, right? And I think you pointed out like intermediate and advanced, you kind of know what they need to do and they're just rerunning it kind of thing. But how does that relate to for a beginner, for example, like say they don't want to be pushing all the time, right? What kind of tools do you have or what suggestions do you have for people that want to get some sort of novelty out of training without, I guess, doing the same thing all the time?
Yeah. I guess it's dependent on like what their goal is. So say for example, if they're wanting to improve their deadlift specifically, then it's like technique wise, then like we're looking at technique, not necessarily looking to push like massive PRs or anything, but then whilst alongside that we could be like, okay, this block we're really focusing on the squat and just like feel free to go like crazy on it. I guess it just depends like what they like and what their goal is as well, rather than just being like, okay, we're doing X, Y, Z and that's it. Kind of working with the athlete, I think, is really important.
I think just like highlighting that progress comes in many forms, right? So like, for a beginner, yes, they might not want to be pushing load like all the time, but you've been stacking up wins with like technique or just getting a pump, feeling good. Like success isn't always going to come from like more load on the bar on these like top doubles, singles, triples, whatever it is. So like just having discussions around like, like you said before, like what their goal is and tying that back into the phase of training they're in. Maybe you just have a block where you dial low back and you work on bench tech, whatever it is. But just to tie it back really quick before in terms of like the difference between like beginner, intermediate, and advanced, I guess like intermediate and advanced, it's more discussions around like you don't need to be strong, inverted commas, strong all year round, right? Like the training program and the cycles have to be planned a little bit more kind of effectively to make sure that you're getting that athlete to their peak performance 1, 2, 3 times a year, whatever it is. So it's kind of discussions around like I said before, this block, we need to build base, we need to build your volume back up. Don't worry if you're only hitting 10 kilos less than your single, whatever it is. Like we're just building that kind of volume back up, and then you move into like these different phases of training. So like in terms of buy-in for like intermediate and advanced, it's like just making sure that they know that you're not going to be firing cylinders year round in every single block of training. And then on the flip side of things, like for beginners, it's like those discussions around like, having set block goals outside of just more load on the bar. So it's like, technique, getting the pump, feeling good, enjoying training, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think with each of those categories, there's like different expectations, right? And I think programming, um, as well as actually communicating with the athlete is where you're going to get the best outcome, right? And then you could kind of zoom out, and this whole discussion is talking about programming, but it's like then programming becomes another just whole toolkit, um, a whole toolkit for trying to get the best outcomes. It's not the end all be all, but there's many things you can do that help you to get to where you want to be at, right? So yeah, I think to tie things off, I guess to talk specifically about squatting, I think general guidelines is, based off what we spoke about with leverages. Someone who's more efficient is going to be able to handle more training all at once, so higher frequency, high volume, higher intensity, possibly more specific SBD or comp squatting, low bar squatting, right? When we look at strength, that also relates to fatigue management and being able to have these phases of training. Just like we talked about, you're not trying to be strong all year round, especially as you start getting stronger. But when you're a beginner, it's good to be able to push everything all at once and not worry so much about fatigue management, especially in the early days. And recoverability, all that kind of relates to your size, gender. But that being said, higher recoverability, more likely for you to be able to push training more frequently. And slower recoverability based off those factors that you look at, you might need to look at fatigue management a bit more, right? So yeah, a lot of tools that you could adjust. Main ones that we spoke about: frequency, volume, intensity, and exercise selection. I think in terms of programming, those are probably the big key elements that we're going to be talking about in squatting and in future episodes as well. So benching, deadlifting, that's all we're really manipulating, right? But at the end of the day, when we kind of tie it all together, and in the context of like powerlifting prep, we're trying to get it all lined up together to be able to hit a peak performance all three at once on one day, right? So that could be something we could talk about in the future as well, something like a peaking series. So yeah, I think that'll round things up. Thanks guys for listening, and we'll speak to you in next roundtable.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.